Although we are meeting virtually, Just Governance Group would like to acknowledge that its office is on ceded territory of the Algonquin Indigenous Nation. The territory where Canada is located had complex and culturally specific legal, governance, and justice system prior to the creation of the country. As we look at issues pertaining to democracy and human rights, we want to recognize the complexity and plurality of these systems in Canada and other countries. Today, we will discuss the effects of authoritarianism and populism in democracy and human rights. Just Governance Group has observed anti-democratic trends in various countries where it is working, and thus this roundtable is an opportunity to understand global trends and learn about the effects of democracy and human rights and actions to stop authoritarian trends. Today, we have an excellent speaker with a lot of experience in the topic we are discussing today. So I welcome Dr. Seema Shah, that is the head of the International Ideas Democracy Assessment Unit. The unit produced a biennial Global State of Democracy report. The one for this year was just published last week. International IDEA also updates the Global State of Democracy Index annual and in the context of global pandemic. It's co-founded the COVID-19 Global Monitor on Democracy and Human Rights. Dr. Shah holds a PhD in political science from UCLA, where her dissertation focused on patterns of intra-ethnic election violence in Iraq, Kenya, and Sri Lanka. Dr. Shah has worked on election violence, media development, campaign finance reform, human rights research and advocacy, and a standard setting for electoral integrity with civil society organizations in DRC, Kenya, Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, and the United States, as well as with International IDEA. Kimberly, the executive director, will be monitoring the discussion today. And to don't lose more time, I will let Dr. Shah start the presentation.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that? Yes, okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation and the chance to share the most recent findings from International IDEA's Global State of Democracy report, which we launched last week. This report presents trends in democratization for 165 countries around the world, beginning in 1975 and ending in 2020. The findings I'm about to present to you today focus on global trends and patterns, but I encourage you to read our regional reports and our thematic background papers for more in-depth coverage. At International IDEA, we understand democracy to be a very broad concept, and one that can have very many different manifestations depending on a particular society's history, culture, and set of priorities. Although we believe there are core tenets of democracy, the way these are operationalized can look different in different contexts. Overall, we measure the extent to which a country has realized various aspects of democratic ideals along 5 main attributes, which we consider integral to democratic growth. These are representative government, fundamental rights, checks on government, impartial administration, and participatory engagement. As you can see, each of these main attributes has several sub-attributes, and then each of those sub-attributes has a number of individual indicators. Altogether, we're measuring 116 of these indicators over time. And now to the findings. The first is that the world is becoming increasingly authoritarian. We see this in a few different ways. First, the number of democracies has been declining, as you can see on this graph. During the pandemic, the world has lost at least 4 more democracies through either flawed elections. I wonder if people could mute because I'm hearing a lot of background noise. The world has lost at least 4 more democracies through either flawed elections or military coups. These include Mali, Serbia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Myanmar in 2021. It is worth noting that right now, International IDEA is presenting this report and talking about declines in democracy around the world. But when we presented the last iteration of this report 2 years ago, we were looking at a very different situation where we were actually reflecting on the increase in the number of democracies. So that's been a significant marker. Second, for the 5th consecutive year, the number of democracies moving in an authoritarian direction exceeds the number moving in a democratic direction. This graph shows the number of countries moving toward democracy in green and the number moving toward authoritarianism in red, starting in 1975 and going through today. Outside of 2020, the other notable peak in the move towards authoritarianism was in 2009 in the wake of the global financial crisis. Since 2016, the number of countries moving in the direction of authoritarianism is 3 times the number moving in the direction of democracy. Third, authoritarian regimes are acting in ever more brazen ways. The pandemic has provided additional tools and justification for repressive tactics and the silencing of dissent in a broad array of countries. These regimes are buoyed by a lack of sufficient geopolitical pressure, as well as support from other like-minded regimes. Some of them are thriving on the narrative that authoritarian governance is better, not just for economic prosperity, but for pandemic management. In 2021, we saw the president of Belarus order the rerouting of an international flight in order to be able to arrest an opposition journalist. We have also seen authoritarian regimes expand their toolbox with the increasing use of transnational disinformation campaigns as an example of the new ways that we see these countries acting. Overall, then, most of the world is struggling. This graph shows you the trends in regime types over the years. We are currently in a situation where hybrid regimes, shown here in blue, and authoritarian regimes, shown here in orange, outnumber high-performing democracies, shown here in green. Overall, only 9% of the world today lives in a high-performing democracy. Perhaps more worrying than the numbers, however, is the decline in the quality of governance in existing democracies. More democracies than ever are suffering from what we call democratic erosion, which refers to a loss in quality in at least one of our indicators. As this graph shows, in 2020, 43% of democracies had suffered declines in the previous 5 years. Some democracies have declined slightly, perhaps only in one sub-attribute or attribute, while others have had declines across many. In Brazil, for example, we saw significant declines across 8 sub-attributes. This graph shows the democracies that have declined the most over the past decade. All countries on this list started out as democracies 10 years ago. Those that are green at the arrowhead side on the left of your screen remain democracies today, while those that are blue are now hybrid regimes, and those that are orange are now authoritarian. Turkey, Serbia, and Benin went from being democracies to hybrid regimes, while Nicaragua moved from democratic to authoritarian in this period. One of the most serious forms of decline is what we call democratic backsliding. Backsliding refers to the gradual dismantling of democratic building blocks from within the democratic system. The striped countries on this map are backsliding. As you can see, since many current backsliders are large countries, we are in a situation now where more than 2/3 of the world live in countries that are either backsliding or authoritarian. Research has shown that the most important indicators of backsliding are executive action against checks on government or civil liberties. We therefore identify a backsliding episode when declines in the average of our measures of these indicators over a 5-year period cross a certain threshold. The number of democratically backsliding countries has never been as high as it has been in the last decade. Our latest round of data shows 7 backsliding countries: the United States, Brazil, Hungary, Poland, India, the Philippines, and Slovenia. 3 of these, as you can see, are in the EU. The pandemic has only deepened the trend of democratic deterioration, putting a halt to democratization processes that had seemed promising and adding a new layer of challenges to existing democracies. The democracies that have experienced the most concerning developments from a human rights perspective are those that were already ailing before the pandemic. So what we see is that just like with individuals, COVID-19 hit hardest those democracies that had pre-existing conditions. Examples of fragile new democracies with worrying reversals include Mali, Myanmar, Tunisia, and Sudan. In Mali, which had challenged 2020 elections, they have now experienced 2 coups since then. And in Sudan, as you all know, an evolving situation on the ground leaves that democratization process at risk. But the pandemic also impacted even the strongest democracies. In fact, all countries in the world imposed some kind of restriction on basic freedoms and rights during the pandemic. Worryingly, though, it was only in less than half of those countries where these restrictions were temporary or imposed in a constitutionally defined state of emergency. And according to our own global monitor of the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights, as of the end of October, 45% of democracies had experienced at least one concerning development, or something that violates human rights or democratic benchmarks because they are considered either disproportionate, unnecessary, illegal, or indefinite. Still, there is reason to be hopeful. Many democracies have proved resilient during the pandemic, introducing or expanding democratic innovation and adapting their practices in record time. What you see here is a pretty remarkable story of learning. As time went on, you can see that the number of postponed elections, for instance, shown here in blue, decreased dramatically as countries learned to hold up credible elections, even in challenging circumstances. An example that we like to point out in this context is that of South Korea, where the 2020 election stood out as a milestone. Authorities used things like early voting and expanded in-home voting provisions so that COVID-19 patients in hospitals and at home could continue to exercise their rights. The use of augmented reality technology also allowed candidates and voters to stay safe, and the turnout for this legislative election was the highest the country has seen since 1992. Protest and civic action is also alive and well. Pro-democracy movements have braved repression in places as diverse as Belarus, Myanmar, Eswatini, and Cuba, just to name a few. And social movements for tackling climate change and things like racial inequality have emerged across the world. More than 3/4 of countries experienced protests during the pandemic, despite government restrictions. And we know that protests matter, especially in the long term, because they cast doubt on the legitimacy of a regime. They direct attention toward an injustice, force a conversation about that injustice, and have the potential to change the people that participate into lifelong activists. One expert cites protests, in fact, as a gateway drug between casual participation and lifelong activism. So those are the main trends we've seen. I'll stop there before ending with some recommendations just to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Shah, for sharing that with us in the recent trends. We had in conversation with you in preparation for this roundtable, pose some key questions that we'd like to explore, together collaboratively with you and the attendees. One of the first questions is to maybe look more for the causes or the drivers related to the decline in democracy and the rise in authoritarianism, so that we can have a clear idea of how to address the decline in democracy, and what actions, therefore, should civil society, government, and other stakeholders take to stop and slow down the trend towards authoritarianism? And do you think this is a temporary phase that will sort of self-correct over time? Or are we in serious danger of sort of losing democracy as the most legitimate form of government or governance in countries around the world? So sort of with those questions in mind, I'd like to open it up. If someone wants to ask a question, they can unmute and pose a question. Or as Ana Laura mentioned earlier, you can pose a question in the chat as well.
Elba?
Flora? Yes.
Sorry, Flora, and then Elba.
Sorry, was there someone else?
I don't see other hands right now. You can go ahead, Flora.
I wonder if we could hear a little bit about the fact that in many of these countries, the governments are freely and democratically elected. In many of the governments moving towards authoritarianism. I think, for example, of Poland and Hungary. What does that tell us about information, disinformation provided to voters, and voter preferences at this point or in recent years as to the nature of the governments that rule them? And the acceptance of, for example, of major infringements on separation of powers, a free judiciary, and so on. So I'm just wondering if you could deal with that dichotomy. Thank you.
Sure. Do you want me to respond to that, or do you want to take more questions first?
Yeah, maybe you could take note of that, because I also see Elba with her hand raised. Go ahead, Elba.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shah, for the presentation. I would like you, in your response also to Kimberly's first question, to maybe dig deeper into the relation between the increased use of social media and the rise in authoritarianism, especially during the pandemic, which, as we all know, we've been switching and becoming even more digital than we were. And there seems to be a correlation, but I don't know to what extent you've been able to assess this relationship between social media and rise of authoritarianism. Thanks.
Please go ahead, Dr. Shah.
Okay. So in terms of the governments that we see acting non-democratically, despite the fact that they were democratically elected, that's the key when it comes to backsliding. So when we look at a backsliding country, it is the case that those leaders were democratically elected, and not only democratically elected, but the elections were credible. And it's only once in power that we start to see, and backsliding takes an average of 9 years. So it's a slow and gradual process. And what we see is that when there is panic or fear about the sustainability of a certain regime, that's when we start seeing the attacks on the checks on government and civil liberties. And I think that when there are a few, I guess, if you want to say immediate causes of some of this. One is the pandemic, which has put all countries, democratic and not, in a situation where they're struggling to figure out how to balance rights, respecting people's rights, and public health. And then I think there's a battle kind of on a second level between when we think about rights as individual rights or group rights. So if we're trying to protect public health, you know, the dominant conception of human rights, the way it's framed is as individual rights. But there's large segments of populations around the world that believe that actually the emphasis should be on group rights and thinking of societies as a whole or communities as a whole when we think about how to operationalize rights. And I think that's where some of the tension is coming between trying to respect people's rights and freedoms and protecting their public health. We've also seen drivers of backsliding come because leaders that have authoritarian tendencies or populist leaders are speaking to parts of the population that feel ignored. And they're using the right language and the right words that reinforce the fears that many parts of the population that might feel neglected feel. And so they're using an age-old tactic, which is to play on fear and to other certain parts of the population and blame them and use scapegoating tactics to gain electoral support. And that, I think, goes back, and you'll see this in our recommendations, it goes back to the root causes of a lot of this, which have to do with inequality, all forms of inequality, not just economic inequality, but all kinds of inequality that are making people feel neglected and left out and unheard, and that they don't have a fair chance. And they might see their neighbors and their peers have chances which they perceive as unfair. So unless we address those root causes of inequality, also corruption, which is our most stagnant indicator since 1975, it's the one that has changed the least. We've seen the least progress on corruption. And it furthers this belief that the institutions of democracy can't or don't deliver for everyone in the same way, and that they're designed for people who kind of start with a leg up, and they haven't been designed for our current, not only for our current context, but they haven't been designed with the least, with the people who are most marginalized sort of front and center. If we were to design institutions with the people who have traditionally been left out front and center, we would be seeing very different forms of what political participation look like and what the institutions that people use to participate, what those institutions look like. And so when you continue to have these worrying levels of inequality, that's when authoritarianism and populism can take root, even in democratic societies, because even in democratic societies, you see people feeling neglected. And that's what we saw with Trump in the United States. He was speaking to a segment of the population that feels threatened and left out and unheard. So I hope I at least partially answered that first question. In terms of the use of social media and the rise of authoritarianism, it's hard to get data on this. It's one of our constant struggles is getting data on social media. But what I will say is that what we've seen is that social media is just a tool. It's just another tool that, and so it's easier to spread disinformation using social media, but that disinformation always existed. It's just that it was harder to get passed around and for it to gain popularity. And again, why does that disinformation exist? Part of the reason it exists now is because it's monetized. So you can make money by spreading that disinformation. So that's one huge issue. Another issue is it's really hard to tell sometimes what's true and what isn't true. And then things get spread. And this is the important difference between misinformation and disinformation, right? Is that you don't necessarily intend to spread it, but it gets spread because you don't realize the difference. And so you could be participating and things get spread and out of control. And then what we see now is this extreme polarization. And when you have extreme polarization, people can't talk to each other in a constructive way. And when people can't sort of cross boundaries and talk to each other, then that threatens the fundamentals of democracy. Because if you can't have debate and dialogue, then you can't have the flourishing of participation, right? And then those institutions wither. And that's what we've seen in backsliding democracy. So I would say the social media thing it's a big concern, but it's just one other tool in a wide variety of tools.
Thank you. As you were speaking, I was thinking about, well, because we see a lot of those issues in the work that we're doing, weak institutions that don't serve everyone. Well, the military, the coup in Myanmar, and how do you support the civil disobedience movement, etc. But I also wonder about the weakness of international multilateral organizations and the lack of, I guess, power or clear and collective pronunciations around authoritarian you're sliding backwards, the backsliding you referred to. In Myanmar, of course, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations has had a very, weak response. Then there's been Ukraine, with the incursions from Russia over the years, and just a lot of, Nicaragua and the Americas backsliding. So or backsliding to authoritarianism, according to your table in the recent electoral period. So, what can international organizations do, or what do we all need to do? Because we're worried maybe about what's going on in our own countries, but our intergovernmental organizations aren't able to come out with, clear sanctions or reactions to this backsliding?
That's a really great question. I think it's also loaded because it's a difficult line to tread for an international organization to go into a country and say, do this to fix it. What we're seeing actually is that in many cases, they're losing legitimacy on the ground because people want to be able to, for them to believe in the action, they need to feel like they own it. And so I think one of the things that needs to be done better is to focus on organically developed solutions. And in order to have an organically developed solutions, you need to have people come together and decide on their own what their priorities are for change. What is it that they want? What do they see as the problems, and what do they see as the solutions? So that's one thing, is to support more civil society organizations, and now even outside of civil society organizations, less formal communities of people that are coming together. Another thing is to support more citizen-led initiatives where people can have more of a say and more of a voice. And that's what we're seeing with protests as one example, is that people have a lot to say and they want to say it. So we've seen, citizens' assemblies being used really fruitfully in many different contexts where ordinary people have a chance to have a say that matters and that has an impact on an important policy decision. So I would say to widen the array of choices people have to participate. That's another thing. And then overall, I think there needs to be some self-reflection, even in countries that have traditionally been seen as stronger or more high-performing in terms of democratic growth, what their own weaknesses are, and if they can sort of lead by example in that way, not just in always being named, as high-performing democracies, but showing that they're aware where their weaknesses are and that they're willing to address those weaknesses and act on them. That's wonderful. The other thing we've seen is that authoritarian regimes are sharing their playbook. So democracies also need to share their playbooks, right? Like we should be bringing different stakeholders together, whether it's electoral management bodies or government institutions or judiciaries or whoever, to come together from across different democracies to share lessons, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what can we do together? We need to be doing a lot more of that.
Thank you. I wonder if there's any other question right now for, sorry, who's that? Yeah, Zeynep, go ahead.
If there isn't anyone else, yeah. Thank you very much for this presentation. I have actually two questions, but let me ask one first. And the first one is like, have you, I skimmed through the report, but so forgive me if I missed that, but have you looked at also local elections and local democracy initiatives while preparing the report. And the reason why I'm asking is in Turkey, what has happened in 2019 has been very, for us Turkish people, it's been very promising because despite all the challenges that were put forward by the regime to kind of prevent it, like free and fair elections were conducted, and in metropoles, in like most of the big metropoles, actually the local governments changed. And so I would be curious because if this also, if you see any trends like this in other countries that we can learn from, or like how would you kind of evaluate that? And just in parentheses, we were kind of calling Turkey happily like resilient democracy during that period. I'd like to hear about your thoughts. Thank you.
So in terms of the first question, we have an indicator for local democracy in our data set, but it's one of our sort of, that means to be perfectly honest, it's one of our weakest indicators. We don't have a ton of data on local democracy. So in the global report, there isn't a lot of attention on local democracy. Where you will find it is in our regional reports. So we have regional teams around the world who have produced regional analysis, and there we've been able to see where examples of local best practice have come out. So unfortunately, I'm not an expert in that area, but I would encourage you to look at our regional reports for that. And the second question I didn't quite get. You said resilient democracy, but what was the question?
No, this was just a comment. I didn't ask the second, like, because of these elections, because elections were cancelled in Istanbul and they were repeated and the same results happened. And so we called it like resilient democracy. We're still a resilient democracy, like we were joking. The second question I have is with regards to, I don't know, it's more like I don't know if you could answer it, because it's more like a thinking piece maybe for all of us. You commented that like democratic countries could also like spread their formulas. One challenge, I definitely agree in theory and ideally, but then I also think of how actually being a democracy also affects some of these countries' international approaches, for example, with the refugee crisis, and actually like concerns of like, and you can see that in different parts of the world where, like, for example, before elections, a lot of governments, for example, even those that could be really considered democratic would, for example, initiate some conflict or like, I see this tension between like being democratic in the country and also like how the people's feelings kind of affect the foreign policy, and how this in turn affects other like non-democratic countries or the slide towards. And I think one thing that's very much debated in Europe right now is Belarus and Poland and EU. Turkey is also part of that discussion a little bit. I just wanted to kind of bring it up, but it's not really a question in that sense. It's more like something that's worth thinking about maybe, but I'd like to hear what you think.
I think what I take away from what you said is that, what works in one democratic context may not work in another democratic context. Of course, that should be sort of that's a fundamental, but there could be, if we talked more, if democracies talked more to each other, I think those things would come out. There are certain things that can't be transferred from one country to another because it simply won't work. But it still could, in some cases they could work. And in other cases, it could spark ideas, even if it's not the same thing replicated, something similar or some idea that could work in context B that doesn't work in context A could come up. And there's a stream of research actually that looks at mimicking, calling it mimicking in authoritarian regimes and in democracies, to see how, if one country is in a sort of a cluster of countries that are geographically close to each other, how they might mimic each other based on the success or failure of each other's actions.
Just a short comment. Sorry, like I wasn't very clear, but what I meant is this: like when you're in a democratic for example, the example of the Syrian refugees in Europe, like, for example, I was thinking of the context when the Europe, I mean, I will generalize, but like is becoming more and more like anti kind of like people are concerned that there will be a refugee flow into Europe. And so this is what the people demand. And then when the people demand this, the democracies respond by developing policies that will keep the refugees out in other countries, which actually could strengthen authoritarianism in those countries just by trying to keep them out because the foreign policy like, I mean, Turkey's relations with the EU is a very good example of this, I think, over the years, because how the refugee flows and like deals were kind of used to counter certain boycotts or condemnations, etc. That's what I was thinking about.
I see. So I think it depends how we want to conceptualize democracy. So how does, if you're democratically elected and you are facing a situation where you have to decide on refugees entering your country and your constituents are telling you that that is not something that they want, does a democratically elected leader, what are the choices before that leader, and how do you negotiate what your constituents want versus what you might want or what you might think is best? And I don't, you know, Sweden, where I'm based, is often held up as an example of how to do it well, and they have been very welcoming in how they do it, but there has been backlash also inside the country for their foreign policy, and so that has also led to a rise in extremist parties on the right using what the government has done to incite fear and gain electoral support, so much support that now that far right party has seats in parliament when it never for all these years has never been able to gain enough support to have that. So I think we're still looking for countries that have managed to balance that well enough. How do you respond to your constituents in a way that is respectful of the rights and freedoms that democratic countries should uphold?
Thank you. Elisabetta, do you want to ask a question? And then I'm going to call on some of our Elba and Zeynep to provide a bit more context.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kimberly. Yes, I had a question in terms of, I was wondering whether you examine or you look into also the influence of corporate power on these trends in the overall decline of democracy all over the world, whether that is one of the driving forces or, maybe not necessarily driving force, but an important factor that is, behind this trend.
That's a great question. And I think the role of corporations is something that's underexplored in our data for sure. It's not something we measure yet. I will say that the pandemic has pushed us to look at things like vaccine diplomacy and how regimes have used vaccines as a political tool. And we've also looked in a very superficial way at the rise of the sort of entree of corporations into political debates on things like inequality, which we had not seen so much of before. So it's an area of growth for us, but we have not looked at it systematically yet.
It might be interesting to look at tax laws in relation, corporate taxation in relation to democracy and distribution of wealth. Definitely.
Absolutely.
I'd like to perhaps ask Elba Estrada, who has been doing some consulting work in Just Governance Group, and she is a Spanish citizen but resident in Honduras, And Just Governance Group has been doing some work with regard to projects dealing with inclusive governance in Honduras. And so we sort of track some of the political issues and a lot of the issues around femicide and murders of transgender people, and the problems within the criminal justice system, and a bit more lightly some of the political issues and certainly the high levels of corruption. But there was just an election on Sunday, so maybe there's some hope there. So I wanted to ask Elba if she wants to provide some context and comments around Honduras.
Thanks, Kimberly. Maybe I leave Honduras for the last part because these are the good news, but I just wanted to comment on your intervention before about Nicaragua, and from this work that we did at a sub-regional level, at Central America level. Let me share an insight about Nicaragua, which I find very interesting, is that, well, there's obviously a clear authoritarian trend, and that has been confirmed in the past months, and clearly in the run-up to the last elections, where opposition candidates were basically sent to jail by the Ortega government. But interestingly enough, the international pressure on the Ortega government was led by the feminist movement. So before this very clear authoritarian trend in the run-up to the elections, where it was clear that, well, it was very anti-democratic, feminists were already pointing at Ortega and saying, this is backsliding and this is worsening and deteriorating. And it all started because when Ortega, before all this decline, was passed an abortion ban and was, so to say, had feminists against him as the first opponents of his government and first critical. And interestingly enough, feminists were consistently denouncing these backlashes, and were able to convince also very progressive governments, like, for instance, the Spanish government with a partially left-wing government to be critical with Ortega. So I just wanted to mention this because I think also there is a correlation with authoritarian trends and obviously abortion bans. And we see that not only in this sub-region of the world, but I think Poland is also an example where abortion bans or very critical positions against abortion and feminist movements can be also a very clear sign of deterioration of democracy. And just coming back to the region, I lived in Guatemala before, and also commenting on Salvador, where there is, well, I think the case of Salvador is clearly, I mean, in your report, I saw you don't, I mean, you clearly recognize the setbacks, but don't qualify it as a hybrid form, but I think it's already going towards this direction, especially with the last attacks on judicial independence, which is also a big issue in Guatemala. The last news from Guatemala are very worrying because, Guatemala had a very strong independent United Nations-backed organism on corruption, which was the CICIG, which had great successes in the fight against corruption and impunity in the country, and which was expelled out of the country 2 years ago. And since then, attacks on the judiciary, and especially judges working on corruption cases, has increased. And one of the leading attorneys on anti-corruption is now in the US, and this week actually it was published that they issued a file against him on a case. So I think this is all worsening and scaling up the attacks against judges. working on corruption issues in Guatemala, but in Salvador, the president also passed a very polemic decision about renewing most of the judicial positions on the judiciary. So this is also, as you were mentioning before, the playbook. I think this is, it seems that countries are using same playbooks in the region, and also preventing any international anti-corruption efforts, which is a big issue here in the sub-region, in all countries, the higher corruption levels. And ending with Honduras is maybe, well, surprisingly the hope of the sub-region now, after a peaceful election and transparent election, which in Honduras, well, it's in your report, you clearly classified it as a hybrid regime, and I totally concur with that. And just as a background, Honduras had a military coup in 2009, and afterwards the subsequent elections were fraudulent, especially the 2017 one, described by the OAS as having a series of irregularities and inconsistencies, not to say least. And there was a lot of hope, but also fear that these elections that took place on last Sunday, presidential elections that were not going to be transparent again, but luckily there was a huge effort also backed by the international community, by the European Union and the Organization of American States to improve the systems and the electoral body. And luckily the result was also very clear in favor of a change. And Honduras will have the first woman in charge as a president as of January, and it's going to be, well, it's an alliance of several opposition forces, but with clear results, and also I think a clear mandate of renewing many of the aspects that were not, undemocratic aspects. And I can elaborate on some of them, but I think the challenge still remains the judicial independence, which is obviously still really weak in Honduras, and with many corruption cases not moving forward because of the interference from the executive into the judiciary.
Thank you, Elba. I wanted to maybe follow up on some points, and Flora had a question in the chat, and they're somewhat, I think, related, because there's been, say, in Central America, constant focus and efforts around the independence of the judiciary, to strengthen the judiciary, including the prosecution, so that they can address corruption and high rates of crime. And feel like when I go back to Guatemala after being there 25 years ago in the UN mission at the end of the armed conflict, things don't seem to have changed in a few decades. So, what are we to do? And I guess that this is also in some way Flora's comment, that previously you had mentioned that democratic institutions aren't always delivering for everyone. So that leads to exclusion, and sort of gives, I guess, could be a driving factor for increased populism and authoritarianism. So is International IDEA actually looking at different, I guess, models or approaches to help democratic institutions or systems, so that we're not stuck in the sort of a repetitive cycle that we seem to be in some countries or regions?
So is the question about what we should do overall, or with regard to judicial independence?
Well, I think maybe from what I've taken from the discussion so far, it could be both judicial independence, but also electoral systems. And I'd also put into that sort of are there indicators around women? When a woman is president or prime minister, does democracy look different? I think we could look at that, or is proportional representation have more, positive indicators when that system is used, but also judicial independence. I don't know if you're able to address those different aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of say that overall we have a set of recommendations at the global level. We also have recommendations at the regional levels that are very tailored to the problems of each particular region in the world. But our sort of framework for our recommendations this time around is based on this 3 pillars of what we think are necessary for renewal, for democratic renewal. One is delivery, one is rebuild, and one is prevent. So delivery is about recognizing that democracies are currently not delivering in the way that they need to for citizens to have hope. And so we recommend that governments think about recrafting social contracts with their constituents in a way that responds to their needs. So there's a gap currently between what governments deliver and what people want or what people need. And that gap needs to be closed. And what we've identified are the 3 most important gaps to close and most urgently are: 1 is inequality, 2 is corruption, and 3 is environmental sustainability. And those, of course, are overlap with each other, but social contracts need to take those 3 things sort of front and center. This, we think, would help re-inspire hope that democracy can deliver the things that people need to live their lives with dignity, but also to pursue the opportunities that are important to them. And everyone has different priorities, right? And democracy should be able to respond to that diverse set of priorities that constituents have. Second is to rebuild. And by rebuild, we mean bring democratic institutions into the 21st century. And that's not just about making things sort of more accessible online. It's also about rethinking what are the problems we have now, or what are the unaddressed issues that we have never acted on, which are now coming to the fore, and what can we do to strengthen the institutions we have, to build capacity in new democracies, to make sure that they don't face the same problems 3 decades down the line, and to share lessons. And so key to rebuilding is, I think, being bold and disrupting the status quo. There are lots of groups of people in each country that have vested interests in maintaining the status quo for whatever reason, maybe financial reasons, political reasons. We need to disrupt that so that more people, but also more kinds of people, have access to the levers of power. And I think one of the dangers here is that when we say let's redesign political institutions for our current context, people automatically think, yeah, we need to have e-voting and we need to have mobile banking and stuff like that. And the danger there is that there are still large swaths of the world that don't have access to the internet, and where digital connectivity, for lots of reasons, is not possible. And so we've seen in the African context, for instance, that the digital gap has widened significantly since the start of the pandemic, because everyone doesn't have the same access to the digital world. And third is to prevent democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism by investing in education at all levels. So having conversations about what democracy means, starting from elementary school and going all the way through university, by investing in independent media, but in independent civil society, and also figuring out how to get to the root causes of the spread of disinformation. And I think here, when we talk about education and media and civil society, we have to focus on accountability. So how can we ingrain that? And one of the best conversations we had was with the president of Transparency International, who said, we need to think about how to make these things cultural values. we shouldn't see them as these political ideals. We need to see it as a culture. This is a value that we hold as a society, as a culture. And she explained how that's been done for corruption in many cases. Bribery is no longer something that in many parts of the world is something it's not accepted. It's seen as wrong. And how can we get there with democratic indicators as well? How can we make it culturally relevant and figure out what those standards are? And that's done, I think, through education. So that's how we've framed our recommendations: deliver, rebuild, and prevent.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I know you had some slides. We're going to wrap up, I think, with those recommendations. But it tweaked a couple of things in me. Maybe I'm following up on my own comment and Flora's question. Two things. One, last year, I did a review for the Westminster Foundation Democracy, an evaluation of their work around women's political leadership and participation. And I can't answer my own question about having, the national leader, the prime minister or president of a country, and if that's, results in difference. But definitely the trends that I saw across several countries is supporting women political either activism in civil society or political participation in a legislature had certain consequences, at least for legislative change and legislation that was more inclusive. And so, I mean, that's a positive aspect, I think, to support. And the other thing that I recall is in the Americas, the OAS over the years has supported democratic culture and citizenship, and then linked critical thinking and certain 21st century education, or those skills around critical thinking and the use of technology, and linked it to democratic values and citizenship participation. It sounds like that's on sort of the line that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges there is that there's not always a lot of financial resources and human resources sort of assigned and dedicated to that type of work.
Absolutely.
Beyond just a patriotic like civics class
right.
in
right.
high school, but from the first grades of the education system.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to sort of comment on that. And then I wondered before we finish up if Zeynep, you wanted to provide a bit more background or information around Turkey, which is always a fascinating context to be in. I was there a couple of years ago, right about now, I think, or in November, a couple of years ago, and definitely you and I were seeing sort of a backlash against women, as there are in a lot of these more authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one challenge with Turkey is one never knows where to start with, because so many things, so many backlashes happened at the same time on a range of issue areas. And but I can actually maybe provide a more recent context. And I loved this deliver, rebuild, prevent approach. Maybe I can also kind of share with you some of the thoughts within the context with regards to that. So basically, in the recent years, I mean, what happened with Turkey was that Turkey was an EU candidate country, and a lot of reforms were actually were taken during the 2000s, and then happened the Gezi protests, which was a social uprising, and then happened the coup d'etat and the government's response to that coup attempt, and then Turkey in 2018 with a referendum which the electoral integrity of which is this, how to say this, can be debatable, passed to had a regime change to a presidential system from a parliamentary democracy, and there was like gradual decline. So I will not go into the details of that, but currently, currently Turkey is in a grave economic crisis, with like the value of Turkish lira is really going really very, very low. We have we in 2019 we had local elections, which I had mentioned earlier, where some of the metropoles changed hands, and in 2023 there's going to be elections, general elections, but the opposition parties want to have the elections like they want to have early elections. I mean, I summarize it like this because I would like to maybe talk about more about some of the issue areas. One thing is that, first of all, the local elections were quite important in Turkey because, and this is about maybe related to kind of delivering, because I think the opposition prior to 2019, one can say that they were very reactive, they weren't proactive. They were very much like, they couldn't set their own agenda. They were mostly responding to the governing party's agenda. And then in 2019, prior to the elections, this started to change somehow. And especially in the metropoles, the members of the candidates were able to kind of really drive their own agendas forward by being close to the people, and they were from actually almost all of them, I think, were already like district mayors, and they were all, so they were known in the metropoles by some of the people, and then they were actually, so they knew and they had experience, and they were candidates for the provincial municipalities. And so this was kind of an interesting to see that like they were able to really mobilize support, and they opted for a more uniting discourse, because Turkey is also very polarized, because polarization actually helps win elections, or it did help win elections so far. But at the same time, there was this feeling, because, you know, there's also the sense of we the people, like there's also a sense of loss of this, because you get tired of polarization after a while, you know, you want to feel like a united community in a way, you know, this imagined united community. And I think they were able to really see that and use that in their discourses also to kind of convince people and mobilize them, and also saying like, okay, you won't vote for me, but I will still kind of will hear you. I still will be your governor. So this, I think this discursive change was really important. And then actually there is one thing about, which is very important, is that in the recent years, after Gezi, there was this citizens mobilizing to protect the ballots. And I mean, this movement couldn't really help protect the ballots as much as in the 2018 regime referendum. However, I mean, it was the citizens, independent citizens actually, who came together and pushed the opposition political parties to actually really protect the ballots in a much better way. And this kind of, although it came a bit slower than it should have, in the 2019 elections, we actually saw that there was a lot of citizen engagement, also brought by the hope of the discourses of these like people. People were really like there to protect, a lot of volunteers actually were there to protect the ballots. And this was also very important, I think. And then there's also the media, because in Turkey, media plurality was almost gone in terms of what was, if you think of like the mainstream media. But in the recent years, there's like independent media emerging, who actually broadcast, many were closed, by the way, after the coup attempt, even though they have no relation with the coup attempt. And then like these independent media, who were actually, many of them are streaming from YouTube, they were actually able to really reflect on the actual electoral, how would you say, like real-time news, maybe you could say, because this is also a bit about like keeping the people in the ballots, because you provide information to the people, so, and the people have the hope, so they protect the ballots. So I think that was also very interesting to see this media and citizens interaction during the elections. And so, I mean, I think it was also, so it actually gave so many people also hope that like there's a lot of, like if we can mobilize and if we pursue the right ways, if you take responsibility, there are things that still can be done. And as a result, like a lot of metropoles changed hands to opposition party members, and Istanbul elections where the CHP party won. It was cancelled with very unconvincing arguments by the High Council of Electorate. But then once it was repeated, actually the difference between the two political parties was even bigger. So the opposition won again with even a bigger sense. And a lot of people who are actually very loyal to the governing party, some said that they found it very unfair that the elections were cancelled. So they actually, although they love their party, they voted for the other candidates. So this was kind of interesting to see like how people can be influenced. And that's why we, sorry, I said it a little bit out of context at first, but this is why we were like saying it's a resilient democracy nevertheless. And currently, it's an interesting time again, because Turkey is really in a very, very grave economic crisis right now. It doesn't have to be like this, but and the thing is, it's an interesting thing. I mean, normally governments, of course, use economic crisis as a way to kind of rally the people around authoritarianism. But in Turkey right now, it's the same government for the last 20 years. So the economic crisis right now is having adverse effects, and the support for the ruling party has declined significantly in comparison to previous years. And what is more important is that like the opposition, so I think it's really important to actually, when you were talking about deliver, rebuild and prevent, but especially with deliver and rebuild, I was really thinking, okay, actually this speaks so much to the opposition parties. This is also what they should do, because the governments might want to become authoritarian for their own sake once they're in governments, but the opposition actually should really convince the citizens that, you know, like democracy will deliver to them. And for the first time in Turkey, we are kind of, I think, seeing that discourse emerging with regards to inequalities and corruption, not so much with environmental sustainability. We cannot really get there because of other problems. But for example, there's some interesting, they did this interesting maneuver, which is debatable, but let me share it. Like, so what they're doing is corruption in Turkey has a word for it, like yolsuzluk. They're not using this because this word is politicized. So they're saying instead israf, which is a sin in Islam if you waste resources. So they're using some of these terms which would appeal to the people. I mean, they're not necessarily, of course, I mean, you cannot, for example, try somebody in court for doing israf while you can for doing corruption. But still, it makes people able to think about what's happening within their own terminology. So they also started using this kind of terminology. And very recently, something that was important that happened is that the opposition party leader stated that he takes responsibility for all the blames that all the inequalities they caused, because this is a very secularist. It's the first founding party, although it has changed, but it was established in the early 1920s, and like it was Atatürk's party, and it was very secular and secularist even, like, and for example, it wasn't always at peace with Muslim communities or with Kurds or with some other minorities. And the opposition leader recently has stated that we have also done wrong, and we have to, again, they use this Islamic term like helalleşmek. Helalleşmek is when I say, you did me wrong, but I forgive you. And the other one also says that. So you're kind of like a kind of reconciliation in a way. And he said that we should do this because our people are tired of being enemies against each other, and this is really keeping us from doing better things. So this discursive change is really exciting right now, and and they're using the social media much better than before. There's also some, I mean, we will see where we get, because I mean, of course, in Turkey, the institutions have been very much eroded from their, how to say, like, the institutional culture. There was an institutional culture, even if when they didn't perform so well. So I mean, there's a problem there, of course, and but there's some kind of, at least at the discursive level, there's some hope. And so I mean,
sorry, can I interject a bit, Zeynep, because we're running out of time? And
sure, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. People are going to have to leave, or have been messaging me that they have to leave. I appreciate, though, you coming in with such, when I think of Turkey and all the problems there, and I think it's really, you were able to give some hopeful examples of how things may be changing slightly, or that there's these openings, and that the opposition and others need to take an opportunity to make those changes. So I wanted to hand it, I don't know if anyone has any comments, if Dr. Shah, if you have any comments around the situation in Turkey that Zeynep described, or if you want to wrap up and give your final comments.
Sure, I found what Zeynep was saying really interesting, and I think it speaks to what I was pointing to with the fact that we need to make these things cultural values. And so it's interesting to hear about how that's happening, and using terminology that resonates more locally for whatever reason in the context of Turkey. And it'll be interesting to see what that does in the long term and how it works and whatever. But also what you were saying about local elections and the interplay between media and citizens is also, I think, that could turn into a very useful sort of, depending on what happens, best practice case for other countries to model. And in fact, I think it was in 2014 or 2015 that Turkey also was making headlines because of civil society there using social media to mobilize people to watch the elections. And there was one organization that received a lot of attention. I think they sort of invented it in Turkey and did really well. And I saw that same model being used, and I have seen that same model being used in different countries around the world. And I think, again, that speaks to this need and hope, which is why we have hope, despite the negative trends, for democracy, that people do want to be involved and do have something to say, and that it's beyond just voting, right? There are lots of ways for people to participate. And it sounds like, I mean, the examples that Zeynep gave are wonderful ones, I think.
Thank you. Let's hope that they have success in Turkey and beyond.
Just a small addition, maybe. I mean, the women's movement in Turkey is also very strong, and they are on the streets no matter what happens. I mean, we are on the streets no matter what happens, and I think that's also like something I should definitely mention. But
I think the women's participation maybe is something that. And citizen participation is so important. A couple of years ago in a co-praxis, or a year or so, I'm sorry, I can't remember, we had a co-praxis bulletin around citizen participation through digital means, and how, you know, important that is becoming to promote democracy and direct democracy in a lot of ways. Seema, do you want to wrap up? Do you want to show your final slides? I
don't think it's necessary. I mean, I think it's just the three pillars that I talked about, but I would encourage you to look at the report. We have a website that's dedicated to it, which is just idea.int/GSOD, which stands for Global State of Democracy. And I hope you will reach out if you have any questions, or if anyone wants to talk more or about this report or anything else. I'm happy to talk.
Okay. Well, I wanted to thank you very much for preparing the presentation. I know it's a busy time given the report just came out, I guess last week, and everyone is in a busy period right now. So I appreciate people coming online, and thank you, Elba and Zeynep, for sharing a bit more about sort of national and regional issues related to democracy and authoritarian trends. And thank you, everyone else. Thank you for attending. And we'll be putting the recording up online next week sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Have a nice
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.